Hello students, and welcome to part 2 of the nuclear energy lecture. Today we're going to talk about accidents and the Hanford nuclear site here in Washington State. So we're going to go in chronological order. So the nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island was here in the United States. It happened in Pennsylvania in 1979. It was pretty much the first ever well-known nuclear accident. One of the reactors at that site in the middle of the night lost coolant and the core suffered a partial meltdown. Some people think that part of this accident was human error due to sleep deprivation. But at the end of the day, 50,000 people were evacuated and another 50,000 fled the area. There were unknown amounts. There was basically what happened was a big geyser of radioactive steam was let out at the top of that reactor number 2. And they estimate about 15 to 24 curies of iodine-131 was released during that accident. So keep that number in mind, 15 to 24 curies of iodine-131, and that's radioactive. Keep that in mind as we compare that to other accidents like Chernobyl. So partial cleanup and payment, damage claims cost $1.2 billion. And there was a study that did tie some increased cases of cancer to this, but at the end of the day, this was not a terrible accident. But it did highly freak out the American public on nuclear energy. It was really bad timing, but 2 weeks before this accident happened, a movie that starred Jane Fonda and Michael Douglas came out that was called The China Syndrome. And in that movie, there was a government cover-up of a nuclear power plant about to have a major meltdown. And so the government officials were saying, don't worry, we have it under control. And then 2 weeks later, when 3 Mile Island happened and government officials were saying, don't worry, we have it under control, people were not believing it. But really, this was not a huge accident. However, it did release radioactive iodine, 15 to 24 curies into the atmosphere. Iodine-131 doesn't have a super long half-life, so at this point, this area no longer has any remnant radioactivity from that accident. So I deleted the video I was going to show you on this because of YouTube copyright issues. So we're going to go ahead and move on then to Chernobyl. And in 1986, so 7 years later, there was an extremely serious nuclear accident. In the case of Chernobyl, they did suffer a complete meltdown and the entire plant exploded. This was part of the Soviet Union at the time, and they were not exactly forthcoming as to how big an accident this was and what had happened. And people in Scandinavia started picking up some fairly large amounts of radiation in their atmosphere. And if you look at the second map, it actually circled the globe, and you can see that some of that radiation even reached Washington State. So eventually the Soviets came out and said, yes, we had a major nuclear meltdown at one of our plants in the Ukraine. So again, I had to delete a video because of YouTube copyright about the Chernobyl liquidators, but I will link those on my website on Schoology. So I've created these slides instead. You don't have these in your notes. But the radiation was too intense. They tried to send in robots initially to clean up the mess. Like literally the fuel rods of the nuclear reactors were launched into the air during this explosion. But the radiation was so intense that the electronics of the robots would fry or the robots would get stuck in the debris. So they had to rush in workers to shovel all that debris back into the plant so they could try to cover it up in this big thick cement sarcophagus. The radiation was so intense that each worker was allowed to work for only 1 minute. So they had to run in, work as hard as they could, and then run out, and they would send in another group of men to do it. So in total, it took 600,000 people to contain the material and then to build the sarcophagus. At least 31 of those men died from acute radiation sickness, and I don't know how many other of those men died from cancers down the road. But because this was a rush job, each group of men only had a minute to work. They didn't do the best job of building that sarcophagus. They didn't seal off all the joints, and there were openings in the ceiling that allowed water to get in that then caused corrosion. So, down the road, this sarcophagus, just like when you think about what it took to build it, 400,000 cubic meters of concrete, 16 million pounds of steel, the sheer weight of it caused settling in the ground, and then the whole thing started to crack, and those leaks that were already there that allowed water to get in allowed corrosion to start. And they worried that eventually that entire sarcophagus was going to collapse, and they would then be, again, back at the point where there would be a major amount of radiation being let out into the atmosphere. So they built a structure called the New Safe Confinement Structure. It was built in Italy, I think, and they rolled it in and put it in place. It's supposed to keep everything contained for the next century. And in the meantime, they're dismantling that old sarcophagus, which is now underneath this new safe confinement structure. So at the end of the day, 400,000 people were forced to leave their homes. A huge area remains contaminated. And when you think about, it was 15 to 24 curies in the case of the 3 Mile Island accident in Pennsylvania. For Chernobyl, we're looking at 35 to 49 million curies of iodine-131 was released into the atmosphere, as well as all kinds of other radioactive elements. So that zone, so, you know, in 1998, which was 12 years after the accident, the Ukrainian government reported, you know, over 3,000 deaths. However, scientists since that time have reported, they think there's been at least 40,000 deaths due to cancers that have happened over the decades since Chernobyl caused from this accident. They think over 500,000 people were exposed to fairly dangerous levels of radioactivity. And just the cost, that incident cost, I think what I'm quoting there is actually pre that new confinement structure. So I don't even know the total cost of the Chernobyl accident in dollars. The cost in lives was very high. So there is now a zone of exclusion, which is 1,000 miles squared across, about the size of Rhode Island. So that land there is pretty much permanently ruined for a human habitation. And, you know, as far as, there's a lot of stories about Chernobyl. I think there's that show on, is it HBO? And I mentioned this in the last lecture, but iodine is taken up by the thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland takes in iodine and naturally. And so when there's radioactive iodine, your thyroid will take that in. And one of the most common types of cancer during these, for people who are exposed to radiation from nuclear accidents, is thyroid cancer. So the idea of taking thyroid pills is to put non-radioactive iodine in your thyroid so that you can hopefully prevent your thyroid from absorbing that radioactive iodine. So again, you know, this is only, it's not a total fix from keeping your body from taking in that radiation. It won't keep you from getting exposed to direct radiation if you're in an area that has radioactivity. But at least it will help your thyroid from storing a radioactive element to where it can sit and cause more damage in your thyroid. All right, so moving forward then, we went several decades without a major nuclear accident. And because of that, a lot of countries moved forward with really expanding their nuclear capability. And then in March 2011, a size 9 earthquake hit Japan, and it created a tsunami. Japan is one of the best prepared countries on the planet for earthquakes. They get a lot of them, and because of that, they have excellent earthquake prevention, or earthquake mitigation protocols. But a size 9 is highly rare. In the history, since we've been able to measure earthquakes, we've only had about 5 size 9 earthquakes. So just like they were supposed to, the reactors immediately shut down. The problem is that while you can shut down a reactor, you can't stop a chain reaction. Remember, that's a positive feedback loop. It is self-sustaining, and you can't, even though you can shut down the reactor, that chain reaction is going to keep going for quite some time. So they had emergency generators, and they came online just as planned, so that the emergency generators would run the cooling systems to keep water and all the cooling, you know, basically water in place and keep the pumps going so that you could keep that chain reaction from getting out of control. So however, what they didn't plan for was 50 minutes after the earthquake, a tsunami was able to overwhelm the seawall, 5.7 meters, which is quite tall, at the plant, and that seawall flooded the rooms. Unfortunately, the generators were in a basement, and the water from that tsunami flooded the generators and took them out. So they were no longer able to keep those chain reactions cool. And this was unlike Chernobyl in that instead of a one-time explosion that, you know, happened, and we're not sure, I'm still not sure to this day what led to that Chernobyl explosion, this was a slow rolling disaster. The accident, the earthquake happened, the tsunami happened, and then over the course of the next several days, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear meltdowns happened. And I said meltdowns plural. So of the 6 reactors, 4, 5, and 6 were actually not operational, and that is super lucky because the ones that were operational, reactors 1, 2, and 3, suffered meltdowns over the course of the next few days. So when they exploded, they sent plumes of radioactive stuff into the atmosphere, and radioactivity was measured as far away as United States here in Washington. However, what reached us was not a whole lot of radiation. So there was an initial spike, and then over time, the amount of radiation in the atmosphere dropped down. You can see here in this bottom graph, there were 3 explosions, 1 for each of the reactors. And they happened over a few days. So it was more of a slow rolling disaster. The Japanese officials initially found no large levels of radiation exposure to residents near the plant. Because it wasn't an immediate thing, they were able to evacuate residents. However, there was a really heroic group of people called the Fukushima 50 workers at the plant who stayed, and they stayed to try to keep those generators going or to get them restarted. They were actually taking the car batteries out of their cars and hooking them together to try to provide electricity to keep those cooling systems going, but they weren't successful. And eventually they did have meltdowns. Over 1,600 workers are estimated to have taken pretty high doses of radiation. So there was an evacuation zone created, so 12 miles across versus the 1,000 miles in Chernobyl. There is long-term contamination, and these numbers down here are given in microsieverts, which is not a unit that I understand very well, so I converted it, and what the Japanese are getting from that accident is about 53 milligrams per year. Now remember, the average dose for Americans is what, 350, 360 milligrams per year, so 53 is actually not a very high dose of radiation. All right, so there was also, because this was right on the ocean, remember all nuclear power plants require a cooling source. Because the plant melted down, so here's your basic nuclear reactor that you've seen a picture of in our last lecture. What happened during the meltdown was these fuel rods overheated and ended up not just exploding out the top, which was the explosions we saw, but also melted down through the bottom of the containment reactors were breached in the bottom, and radioactive material was spewed out into the ocean. So besides iodine, there's a whole lot of other elements. Cesium-137, and that has a half-life of 30 years. Cesium-134, half-life of only 2 years. Those were dumped into the ocean. And those were measured as of 2013, a couple of years after the accident. So current status, that there are more than 40 reactors sitting idle in Japan. They shut down their entire nuclear program after this accident to kind of rethink what they were doing. They have removed a whole lot of the fuel rods, and removal at reactor 3, I think, was the last one, started just this last year. But there's really high radiation there still. So people who are doing this work have to be very careful that they don't get overexposed. The site is still too radioactive to do what they did at Chernobyl, which is to encase it in cement. And there's also the problem of that leaking fuel in the bottom. They did finally get a robot who was able to swim underwater and take pictures of some of the melted fuel at the bottom of these reactor plants. But they are looking at cleanup taking at least 40 years. And it's a huge mess. They have not been able to contain it to date. So, and these buildings, of course, are deeply damaged and could collapse. And then, of course, the contaminated water. So 720 tons of water per day are pumped through those reactors to keep them cool. And then that water is radioactive. So where do you put it? They have to store it. So this is a huge amount of water. I mean, we're talking tons of water per day. And then there's a whole lot of groundwater that flows by that contaminated, those melted down fuel reactors and carries it out to the ocean. So again, this is a pretty epic nuclear disaster. All right, and then finally, Hanford, not a nuclear accident, but it is a mess. And it's right here in our own Washington state. It's located in the Tri-Cities area, right on the Columbia River. Again, whenever you have a nuclear power plant, you need a water source. And it was where we produced our weapons starting during the World War II era. And we enriched the plutonium there. So back in the day, we didn't understand nuclear energy very well, nuclear radiation that well. And they released openly materials into the environment for over 40 years. But because this was top secret weapons, plutonium enrichment site, the government did not tell any of the public what was going on. And all of these releases into both the air, the ground, and the water went on for 40 years without anyone knowing except for the government. So in 1986, they finally came out with it. In 1987, they created an agency to study the contamination and then decide how they were going to clean it up. So this goes back quite a few years. This cleanup is still going on today because there's been a lot of delays. And this is just a picture from 1953. They thought it would be a safe thing to do to just store that radioactive waste in metal gallon containers, like those big caskets, and then just bury it. Problem is that highly radioactive stuff is corrosive, and over time those containers have been corroded, and you're sitting right at water level because you're right next to the Columbia River. And I'm going to show you a picture of what those containers look like today. All right, so during the time back in these days, they were just letting that radioactive stuff right out into the atmosphere. Again, they didn't realize how damaging it was. So iodine-131, the same stuff that was released during the Chernobyl accident, the Fukushima accident, and even the 3 Mile Island accident, they just pumped it right into the air. Even after they put filters in, there are a lot of filter failures who were still causing that release of iodine-131 into the atmosphere. And then the soil and groundwater contamination, remember those pictures of those big containers I showed you? This is what they look like today. This looks funky because it's actually an underwater photo. Those containers are now starting to leak. And there's a lot of radiation there. So more than 1 million gallons with over 100,000 curies of radioactivity have already leaked into the soil. They estimate there's over 200 million curies in those tanks and in that 60 million gallons. So so besides that, at the time, they just injected highly contaminated water right into the ground through injection wells. Again, they didn't realize just how damaging this stuff was. The radioactive materials were found in the groundwater include I could list off, there's tons. There's websites you can go to that list off it's not just the iodine, but there's actually a ton of different elements that are highly radioactive that were basically just put into the groundwater. And then that solid waste, 5 million curies. And so in 2013, they found that at least 7 of those tanks were leaking up to 300 gallons a year right into the groundwater. All right, so at the time, also the Columbia River, they used it to cool the reactor cores. But remember that plant picture I showed you where I said, remember the radioactive water doesn't mix with the water that creates the electricity? In this case, they didn't take care of that. They just basically flushed that radioactive water right back into the river. So, and then whenever radioactive materials built up inside the reactors, they just flushed that right into the river too. So this went on for quite a long time. The worst years were that decade from 1955 to 65. And then finally they shut the whole thing down in 1971. For the public that were living near this area at the time, they received the most exposure through eating the fish that came from the Columbia River, drinking the water, and swimming in the river. So the cleanup has been ongoing, and they're still not very far with that. I'll get to that on another slide. But in 2009, as part of the stimulus package to pull us out of the last recession, Congress gave $6.4 billion to help with some of these cleanup sites, of which Hanford is probably the biggest cleanup site in the country. All right, so what's the current status? In 2015, they were going to open up a plant to convert that fuel, put it into a more stable form in these like glass pellets. And they delayed it till 2039, and partly because the design of these plants that were going to do this were flawed. They didn't meet earthquake standards. There were design flaws. That was fast tracked. 60 Minutes did a whole bunch of stories on it, as well as King 5 News, and just a whole lot of issues with the whole process. And so Hanford to this day is deeply contaminated. And let me just go back for a moment. The stuff that's leaking into the groundwater is still in the groundwater, and the dangers if it reaches the Columbia, once again, the Columbia River will become fairly radioactive. So that concludes our part 2 of our lecture, and I will stop the recording at this point and go stop the recording there, and we'll see you guys next time.